Derek has given this talk a few times, and it always gets rave reviews. So we asked him to do it yet again, and he graciously agreed to give this talk. So without further ado, let's welcome Derek.
Okay, thank you very much, Lindsay, for that lovely introduction. It's my pleasure to talk to all of you today. I have, as Lindsay said, given this talk several times, and it's always a joy to give it again and help bring more people, help bring more new PL students into the community. And so one order of business before I get started is just that I'm going to be asking. It's going to be quite an interactive talk. So I'm going to be asking questions of the audience, and I want you to write. If you would like to. Write your answers or your suggestions into the chat window. So I'm going to use the chat window in AirMeet. So if you go to conversations, chats, already a bunch of people have been commenting in the chat window. Just type your answers in there, and I have a screen open, and I'll be reading those answers as they come in. Okay, so so just to get started, I was just listening to Jose introduce PLMW, and I realized I didn't have any slide initially about my what I'm interested in, but indeed, like Jose and Lindsay, I also love music, but probably I'm better known among people in the community for loving whiskey. So I figured and you can actually see that behind me as well. There's some empty boxes in my office instead of textbook art. Instead of textbooks, that's my whiskey art. So this is actually a picture taken from, I think, 4 years ago or 5 years ago. My collection is disturbingly grown since then. But actually, that's also a very nice picture because you can see in the upper right-hand corner a Blu-ray of like a box set of the Coen brothers, which is also one of my favorite things in life, are the Coen brothers movies. Anyway, and lastly, one bit, if you're interested, I encourage you to check out my blog. I actually haven't written on my blog, my hairdryer blog, in quite a number of years, because basically ever since my daughter was born, for somewhat obvious reasons. But there's a number of posts on there that you might find very interesting. In particular, there's one about imposter syndrome that a lot of people have told me they found meaningful. So you can check that out. So on to the talk. So this talk is about a key thing that people have to do when they do programming languages research, which is you might think that just being a full-time researcher means you get to do research full-time, but in my experience, doing research ultimately becomes only one piece of what it means to be a researcher. The other key pieces of being a researcher have to do with communicating your results to other people. And so, after you've done some piece of research, then you actually have to tell other people about it, and that usually takes the form of writing papers. And you submit them to a conference, and if you're lucky enough to get those papers accepted, then you give a talk about the paper at the conference. And for me, this is like one of my favorite parts of the job, because actually both writing papers and giving talks, because that's the part where you actually communicate with other people. And I am a social person, and I do like to actually interact with other researchers. And they also, if you do that successfully, then you get this great feedback loop. You talk to other people, and they tell you their ideas. And then that gives you ideas for new kinds of research to do. So in this talk, I'm going to focus on the topic of writing papers, and this is because this is actually my favorite topic. I like this more than even any of the research I do or any of the talks I give. I love writing papers, and so the first question I'm going to ask you is: have you actually read any papers, in any research papers recently, like, for example, papers that have appeared at ICFP or any other programming language conference, or even other conferences in computer science? So if you can write in the chat, you could say, yes or no. This is a simple question to start out with. Yes, okay, that's good. Yes, a lot of people have read papers. So the follow-up question then is, how many of you have read a research paper and felt like you have no idea what's going on? Like, this is completely mystifying. This is the follow-up question. Please answer. Yes, that did happen as well. Nobody likes writing papers, my advisor says. Oh, well, that's simply not true. But anyway, yes, so yes. My experience in life is reading papers and being befuddled all the time. In fact, it happened like yesterday. I was reviewing a paper, and I was totally confused by a lot of the things that were going on. So you may think that this is just because you're new at research. But the truth is that, I mean, it's true that, yes, you are new and you may lack the technical sophistication you need to understand papers. But the reality is that many papers are just poorly written. And so, you know, that means there's actually a great, something really good you can get out of learning how to write better papers, right? If you can write clear, accessible papers, then many great things will happen. First of all, people will enjoy reading your papers. You'll feel good about that. People will learn something from them. They might interact with you and give you new ideas for future research. Your papers will get accepted to top conferences at like an astronomically higher rate. You know, you'll become famous. You'll have work will have a lot of impact. You'll make a lot of money. Well, okay, maybe you won't make a lot of money. I'm not sure about that. But at the very least, you will have a lot of satisfaction from actually getting your work across to your audience. So the question is, like, why is this so hard? Clearly it's hard because so few papers are really good. And I think the main reason is because of something that that Steven Pinker has called the curse of knowledge. And basically the issue is you're the writer of the paper. You want to communicate this piece of research that you've done, right? That's your main goal when you're writing the paper. You've done this thing. You want to tell other people about it. And you're very excited about this because you've been working on this for the last, you know, whatever, year, 2 years. And you want to tell the reader all the details of what you did, because that's really the cool part, right? You actually made this thing work. So, you know, you want to like tell them about, I don't know, the pre-axial gaskets, you know, and you achieved 47% reduction in the XPS latency on this bivalve or whatever, right? And, you know, you want to tell them all the inner workings of this gadget that you've done. And what is the reader saying on the other side of this chasm? They're saying, okay, but first of all, what does your thing actually do? What problem does it solve, and why should I care about it? And that's really the first question the reader wants to understand. And that's the question they keep asking as they're reading the paper. Even if they understand at a high level, then they want to understand at a lower level. Okay, so now I understood that part, but now what does the next part do? And why do I care about that at that lower level of detail? And the writer typically has a very hard time communicating this. So it's very hard when you know everything about a topic to imagine what it's like to not know those things. And that's what's meant by the curse of knowledge. So the good news is, there are principles that you can follow that will help you avoid this curse, right? That will help you write clearer, more readable, more accessible prose based on gaining an understanding of how readers process information. Now, when I say that there are, you know, I'm going to tell you about some principles of good writing that will make your work, you know, make your writing clearer, etc. Is there some text that some of you may have been referred to, some classic book that you've been told is the, you know, the key to good writing? The Elements of Style. Yes, right. Thank you. Thank you, Michael Morehouse. So yeah, The Elements of Style is probably the most commonly recommended book about how to write, particularly in English. And in my opinion, it's a terrible book. Okay, so I highly do not recommend this book. There are, of course, some good things in it. There are some useful bits of advice, but by and large, the things that it's most famous for are these sort of aphorisms like be clear and omit needless words. And my feeling is, as someone who's trying to teach students how to write, if I just tell a student to be clear, you know, like if you knew how to be clear and if you knew what words were needless, then you wouldn't need this book, right? So this is totally useless advice. And there's also a lot of advice in that that's just wrong. So I recommend you throw that book away. And instead, I'm going to tell you about some principles that are constructive. Okay, so these are principles that are easy to check if your text satisfies them. And if it doesn't satisfy them, then the principles naturally suggest ways to improve your text. Okay, and these principles that I'm going to tell you about did not come out of nowhere. They came out of a number of inspirations. Probably the biggest one is a book by Joseph Williams called Style Toward Clarity and Grace. There's been several editions of this. You can find this online for free if you just Google for the title of the book and the author. There's a PDF online of one of the versions. And so I highly recommend you check this out. It's not that long, you know, it's like 200 pages or something. It's a great book. And it presents a number of the key points that I'm going to be making in this talk. And there's two other things that I've drawn from as well. One is some technical writing course by Norman Ramsey. The course notes are also online. Very nice course. And Simon Peyton-Jones, in case you don't know him, he's one of the sort of leading lights of our community, particularly the ICFP community. And he has 2 talks that he has that are available online, one on giving great writing papers and one on giving talks. I highly recommend you look at both of those. And I've taken some inspirations from him as well. And last but not least, the work that the ideas that I'm presenting were really developed jointly with my partner, Rose Hoberman. She's in charge of teaching writing and speaking skills to the students here at the Max Planck Institute for Software Systems in Germany. And so a lot of the work that I'm presenting is really developed jointly with her. Okay, so I'm going to structure this talk in 2 parts. The first part, I'm going to focus on low-level writing. So the question of how to, structure sentences and paragraphs in your paper, because I think this is the source of a lot of the problems that students have, especially in the beginning. And then in the second part, I'm going to talk about more high-level structure of how you structure a conference paper in particular. Okay, and feel free to ask questions in the chat. I may or may not be able to answer them. Yeah, the slide there I see. Will the slides be published? Sure, we can definitely publish the slides. I will try to leave a little time at the end for Q&A, and I'm also going to be around after the talk. I can answer more questions then, or at the mentoring session later today. Okay, so we'll get started with sentences and paragraphs. So there's basically 2 major principles that I'm going to focus on here, which I think are the ones that, if you learn anything in this talk, actually, I would say, this is the most important. That's why I lead with them. The first is a principle called flow. And the idea is that this is getting back to this idea of this, this gap between the reader and the writer. You have to sort of pull the reader along at every step, or else they might fall into that gap. Okay, and so you can think about it as you need to make sure how each sentence and paragraph in your text relates to the ones that come before and after it. Okay, so that's the general principle. But how do you actually turn this into how does this exhibit as a problem in writing, and how do you fix it? So I'm going to show you an example. Okay, I'm going to read a paragraph to you, and I want you to think about is there a point during this paragraph as I'm reading it where the text stops flowing, where you sort of fall into that chasm. Security proofs of cryptographic protocols are crucial for the security of everyday electronic communication. However, these proofs tend to be complex and difficult to get right. The game-playing technique, originally proposed by Jones et al., follows a code-based approach where the security properties are formulated in terms of probabilistic programs called games. This is a general design principle for cryptographic proofs to ease their management. Okay, so was there a point in that text, can you please tell me, was there a point where you found that you got lost, or where you dropped the flow? Between sentences 2 and 3, yeah, right, exactly. So indeed, the problem was, what does this game-playing technique have to do with what came before, right? So several people said the game-playing technique, right? Suddenly we're talking about the game-playing technique. Why? Right? This happens all the time in writing. And the reason is, again, because of this curse of knowledge. The writer knew what the game-playing technique was, and they understood, of course, how it relates to everything else. They just forgot that the reader didn't know that, okay? And so what can you do about this? So the solution is a very simple and easy to apply principle called old to new. The idea is that you want to begin sentences with old information, because that creates a link to the earlier text. And you want to end sentences with the new information, because that creates a link to the text that follows. And it also has the effect of placing that new information in a position of emphasis, because readers naturally tend to put emphasis as they're reading on the end of the sentence. It sort of builds up tension, and then finally it's released on the end of the sentence. And so that's all there is to it. And so you just have to if you want to check whether your text follows this old to new principle, you can sort of do a diagram of it. You can look at the text at the beginning of your sentences and the end of the sentences and say which was old and which was new. And you want to try to make sure the old is in the beginning and the new is in the end. So let's look at this sentence we had before, right? The problem was that the game-playing technique was new information. It was not presented yet, and yet it was presented at the beginning of the third sentence. So the solution is to move it to the end, okay? So basically, we could rewrite this text in the third and fourth sentence to make it, however, these proofs tend to be complex and difficult to get right, to make it easier to manage such proofs, Jones et al. Proposed a new design principle called the game-playing technique. This technique follows a code-based approach where the security properties are formulated in terms of probabilistic programs called games. And if you were to do a diagram of this paragraph, you could see that the beginning of each of the sentences, these proofs relates as the beginning of the second sentence that relates to the first sentence. Again, with the beginning of the third sentence also has such proofs, is pointing backwards. But the new thing is the game playing technique, and that's presented at the end of the third sentence where it has the most emphasis. Okay, and then is followed again by this technique, right? So this technique is old information referring to what was just introduced. So this now satisfies old to new. So this is good. This has good flow. Okay, very simple. I wish someone had told me this a long time ago, but it's a really useful principle to keep in mind. However, this alone is not enough. Okay, so to show that, I'm going to show you a paragraph that satisfies flow perfectly, but has some other problem. Okay, so so here I'm going to read this paragraph to you, and I want you to tell me what you think about it. Okay, or what problem it has. Lions and tigers are some of the most dramatic and awe-inspiring species of cats. Most of these large cats, however, are currently facing extinction. A smaller cat that has been more evolutionarily successful is the house cat. Although house cats are currently the most popular pet in the world, they are in many ways antisocial. It would therefore be interesting to study whether house cats can be trained to be more sociable. Okay, so what's wrong with, thank you for that emoji. What's wrong with the, too many different ideas in one paragraph, two different topics in the same paragraph. House cats appeared from nowhere. Yeah, well, the house cat, that could locally, that could be fine. So in some sense, this is an example of, right, because flow works, locally it's okay. Each sort of link in the chain is fine. That's something that could occur in a good paragraph. But the problem is there's, yeah, as someone said here, there's no consistent aim or purpose, right? This paragraph is incoherent. Okay, it's lacking a unified purpose. The purpose is to obtain funding. Yeah, I don't think this paragraph would achieve that purpose. So what can you do about it? Well, right. So the general principle here is coherence, right? It should be clear not only how each sentence relates to the previous one and the next one, but it should be clear how each sentence and paragraph in your text relates to the big picture, right? How each sentence relates to the big picture of the paragraph, how each paragraph relates to the big picture of the section, how each section relates to the big picture of the paper. And so the way you achieve this is using, or the way I recommend achieving this, there's maybe other ways, but the way I recommend it is through a principle called one paragraph, one point. So the idea is that each paragraph should have one main point, which is expressed in a single sentence, which you call the point sentence. And this sentence could occur in different places. Typically, it's, especially with writers who are less experienced, I recommend putting it at or near the beginning of the paragraph. And then you can think of it as the beginning of the paragraph up through and including the point sentence is kind of like the theorem of the paragraph. At least that's how I think. I'm someone who proves theorems for a living. So I think of that as the theorem, and the rest of the paragraph is kind of the proof of that theorem. All right, it's giving the establishing the information that helps establish that point. So let's go back to this paragraph again, right? The problem was you can diagnose this by saying, well, yeah, there's something wrong with this paragraph, but I can't quite figure out what it is. Well, the problem is there's no sentence in here that summarizes the entire point of the paragraph. Obviously, because there's no point to this paragraph, right? There's no coherent point. So the solution is usually with flow, you can often fix the problem in more local ways by reordering things within a sentence. But with coherence, you often have to rewrite it because usually it's a more conceptual problem. You don't actually know what you're saying in this paragraph, and you have to rethink about it. You have to rethink it. So here's one way you could do it. This is a different paragraph, not quite saying the same things, but they're related. There appears to be a negative correlation between the charisma of a species and its ability to survive. Lions and tigers, for instance, are among the most majestic creatures in the animal kingdom, yet they are currently facing extinction. In contrast, the house cat is evolutionarily quite successful, even though it is mostly known for stupid pet tricks. So the idea here is that the first sentence is kind of the theorem. This is the point sentence. This is kind of the theorem of the paragraph, and the rest is giving supporting evidence for that theorem. Okay. Great. So those are the two most important principles in writing, in my opinion. And these are the ones that are often not taught to people for some reason, even though they're very basic. And these are also both these principles are discussed in great detail in the Williams book that I mentioned. So you create flow with old to new, create coherence with one paragraph, one point. I want to mention, before moving on to the higher level structure of papers, I want to mention two other principles that I find very commonly come up in revising student writing. One of them I call name your baby. And this basically means that you often have a lot of concepts or systems or objects of interest in your paper. And one problem that students often have is they don't give them a name, or they don't give them a consistent name. And it's really useful to have names for things. So the idea of Name Your Baby is when you have something that comes up more than once, or plays an important role in the paper, name it, okay? Give it a name, and give it a unique name that you use consistently, right? You don't want to use the same name for different concepts, and you don't want to refer to the same concept with different names. You want to have a sort of one-to-one relationship between the key objects or agents of interest in your paper and their corresponding names. The second principle I call just in time, and this basically means that you want to give information precisely when it's needed, not before. So this typically arises in papers when people give large background sections, right? So you often see in a paper like section 2 is background on the area, and there's a lot of technical stuff in there about previous approaches or about whatever. And the problem is that a lot of that information is just hard to remember, right? If you can't expect you can only expect that the reader's brain is kind of small. Okay, they can only store so much information, and so you want to only give them the information, the background information that they need at the point when they need it, not sort of front loading with all this background. Okay, and that's the idea of just in time. So this is these two principles come up a lot. There's a third principle actually that Rose suggested I add just because it's really quick to explain. And comes up a lot as well, which is short subjects. And this one's easy to check for. Basically, you want your subjects of your sentences to be short, okay? At most 8 words long, okay? Sometimes it's 10 words long, but basically pretty short, because as a reader, in English at least, is reading a sentence, they're looking for the verb, they're looking for what's happening in the sentence. And if it takes too long to get there, they sort of get muddled, okay? And it becomes hard to figure out what's going on. So try to keep your subjects short. Okay, so that concludes my discussion of low-level writing principles. It says here, if you write questions on the Q&A tab. Oh, I see, yes. Yeah, if you would like to, so I'm not gonna, in the interest of time, I'm gonna move on and take sort of questions about everything at the end, okay? But if you want questions, if you want me to answer some questions at the end of the talk, I recommend putting those in the Q&A tab on Airbeat, okay? All right. So we'll move on now to structure of a research paper. So this is the higher level question of how you move up from those lower level techniques to actually structuring your papers. And I'm going to focus here on conference papers. Okay, so there are of course other kinds of papers, and there's a lot to say about those. But the conference papers are sort of the main thing that we end up writing in research in programming languages. So it's important to understand how to structure a conference paper. You have to understand like what happens when you write a conference paper. And what happens is you have to submit it to a conference to get accepted, okay? So that means, you submit it to a conference like ICFP, and there's a program committee that the program chair has appointed for that conference. So here's a program committee from a conference a number of years ago. This committee contains a bunch of different people from different backgrounds, okay? And then what happens is the program chair selects through some mechanism, okay? Sometimes people bid for papers, sometimes there's some automatic system. The paper is assigned to a number of reviewers, often like 3 to 5 reviewers. And those people review your paper, and then, there's a process that goes on after that, but basically your fate is in the hands of this 3 somewhat randomly selected group of people. And so you have to think about what that means in terms of, what are you trying to communicate? And so there's basically 2 points to take into account here. The first is that the program committee is diverse. It's intentionally diverse, right? When the program chair sets up the program committee, they're trying to get people from a bunch of different backgrounds. And even when they appoint people to review your papers, they're not necessarily just picking people who are experts. In fact, they may not even have 3 to 5 experts on the committee for this particular subject of your paper. So you may get some reviewers who are not experts. The PC chair will try to pick someone at least one person who is an expert, but the others may not be. The other important point is that the review period is short, okay? So typically around 2 months. And during that period, each PC member may have a number of papers to review, something on the order of like 10 to 20, sometimes even more. And that means, given that they have day jobs as well, or they may be on vacation for half the time or whatever, they often have less than 1 day to review each paper. So that's not really very much time. And so, taking those 2 points into account, there are 2 overarching principles that I'd like to share with you that help me in thinking about what I'm trying to achieve in writing a conference paper. And they're related to these points about diversity and the short reviewing period. So the first overarching principle is what I call top-down. So the idea of the top-down principle is that you need to try to explain your work at multiple levels of abstraction, starting at a high level that's accessible to non-experts, and then getting progressively more detailed as the paper goes on. And this is really addressing both of those points I mentioned on the previous slide. First of all, it's addressing the diversity point, right? You have diverse readers, even, obviously you have diverse readers in the real world who read your paper, but particularly when it's being reviewed, you have diverse readers then, and you need to be able to reach all of them. You can't just expect to only communicate to the expert, okay? So you have to really, start with a high enough level of abstraction that the non-experts can get it. The other point is the short reviewing period. Even for the experts, they don't have that much time to really dig into the details of your paper. So it really helps them if you can start at a higher level, explaining what you think your paper is about and the basic ideas of it, and then working progressively more into the details. Okay. The second principle is what I call tell them what they want to know. So, and this mainly relates to the fact that they don't have that much time. But even when I'm reading papers, not in a reviewing setting, just when I'm trying to understand a paper, I often, before I get into the details of it, there's some basic questions I want answered, and I want them to be answered quickly, or else I get frustrated and I start to not like the paper. And so, what are these questions? Well, this is something I'd like to ask you. So I have questions. So if you could write in the chat, what kinds of things, when you're starting to read a paper, what do you want to know about what the authors have done? What does it do? The purpose, what is the contribution? Yeah. What's the problem you're trying to solve? And yeah, why should I care? Will help solve my issue. Okay, yeah. Anything else? Yeah. So these are all in some sense more, what are the typing rules? Yeah. So in some sense, these are more specific things. I'm actually asking here more abstractly. We'll get into the specifics of what sections should be in the paper, et cetera, right? But leap of outcome, that's a good one. Leap of outcome compared to prior work. So how is this actually doing something differently from prior work? So I'll tell you. So I think there's different opinions about what the audience wants to know. But I'll tell you what my opinion is based on my experience reading and reviewing papers and writing them. So basically, the 3 things that I think are the most important to communicate, the ones that I want to know when I'm reading a paper is, first of all, how is your work important? So basically, that's related to this question of, what problem is it solving? Why should I care? Like, why is this relevant to anybody? The second is, how is it novel? So that was suggested by someone, said leap of outcome compared to prior work, right? So what is the new thing? What is the delta from prior work, right? Why is this paper doing something new that other papers previously weren't doing? And lastly is this sort of hard to pin down point about interestingness, okay? And there's disagreement about this. I got into a Twitter argument about this with some other researchers a while ago, some of whom thought, well, papers should just be accepted regardless of whether they're interesting or not. That's too subjective, et cetera. But the reality is, if you just accepted all the papers, that whether or not they're interesting, we'd be flooded with a gazillion papers, and then you're kicking the can down the road to the next person who's going to have to somehow filter those papers into which ones are interesting and which ones aren't. So my opinion is you should make an effort as a writer to make your work seem interesting, so that that will have the positive effect of answering the question that the reader naturally has, which is what is actually interesting about it. What can they take away from it? There's one point that I think you don't have to worry about that some people think you do, which is how is your work challenging? Proving to the author, proving to the readers that your work is hard, or is solving some problem that was really challenging, that couldn't be solved in some simple way. In my opinion, this is not important. In fact, I love papers where the solution is simple. And my experience is that if you can explain why your solution is why you're solving an important problem, or what's novel about it, or the fact that no one else came up with this simple solution before, then it doesn't matter if your solution is relatively simple. Your readers should appreciate this. Of course, there will be cases where you get reviews from a conference saying, this wasn't complicated enough, reject. I mean, like, who cares? You submit to the next conference, it'll eventually get in, and people will appreciate it. Yeah, as Simon Peyton-Jones says, simplicity is great, except I completely agree. Okay, so those are the overarching principles, but now let's turn those two principles into some more concrete principles of how you structure a paper. So I'm going to give you a structure for papers that I find works pretty well in many cases. Doesn't always work, but if you can structure your paper this way, it's a recipe for success. So the paper starts with the abstract, of course, that's required. It has to be a paragraph or two. Then an introduction, a key ideas section. I'll get back to that a bit later. The technical meat, which takes up most of the paper, and then related work section at the end. Okay, so this is the structure I recommend. And I'm going to talk about 4 out of the 5 of these sections. Can anyone guess which section I'm not going to talk about in the remainder of this talk? Technical meat. Okay, yes, very good. Thank you. The answer, indeed, can anyone then say why I'm not going to talk about technical meat? There's a very specific answer for why I'm not going to talk about it. There's actually a lot to say about how to write a technical section, but yes, too dependent on subject matter is indeed it is often dependent, but there's still a lot one can say because very few people read it. That's what I was looking for. There's only 5 readers. Okay, I mean this is obviously an exaggeration for comic effect, but the reality is compared to the abstract of your paper or the introduction or key ideas or the related work, there's far fewer people read the technical section. And so it's just not the one that's the most important to focus on if you're trying to improve your chances. So I'm going to start with the abstract and intro, and actually basically my advice for how to structure the abstract and intro, my advice for structuring the abstract is the same as my advice for structuring the intro. And so I'm going to just discuss this mainly in the context of the abstract. It's a model I call the CGI model. And so the CGI stands for context gap innovation. So basically, this is the 3 stages of your abstract or your intro. The first stage is context. So you want to set the stage, sort of motivate the general topic that you're studying. Okay, and this often means sort of cluing the audience into the generally accepted knowledge about this topic, or some sort of uncontroversial statements, hopefully uncontroversial statements about the general problem you're working on. And that's mostly just sort of to clue people into like what kind of expectations you have as the author. But you should be, and this is something where you actually need to get advice from probably your advisor about what is a reasonable starting point for your paper. But this shouldn't take very long. So typically the context only takes like a paragraph or 2. And then you're moving directly into the gap. And this is the really key part that a lot of people forget to put in, which is you're building up to explaining your specific problem and why existing work does not adequately solve it, right? Often people sort of explain a lot about existing work, but never quite concretely say what exactly is the problem with it that the new work is solving, okay? Or that your work is solving. So really, hit the hammer on the head, right? Oh, hit the nail on the head, sorry. Explain what you're actually solving. And then that leads to the innovation, which is where you state your contribution. You state what it is that you've done that is new and explain how it helps to fill the gap that you stated, okay? It's important to note, it doesn't have to completely fill the gap. Often, we don't completely solve the problem we're working on. We make progress on it, and that's fine. You could even take this section to explain the limitations of what you've done. But the key is to show you have to state how it's contributed to filling that gap from prior work. And so looking back at those overarching principles, we see this is sort of an example of top-down. We start from the highest level of what we think where the readers might be at, and then we get deeper and deeper into our specific problem and sort of educating them about that, and then finally telling them more details about what we've actually done. And it's also it's addressing these questions about what the reader wants to know. So context and gap go to show the importance of the work, why it's relevant to anyone, and the gap and the innovation go to explain the novelty of the work. What's the delta over prior work? So I found this a very useful way of thinking about my abstracts and intros. To give you a simple example, here's an abstract for this very talk that I'm giving you today. I'm just going to read it to you. So first, the context. Learning to write well is an essential part of becoming a successful researcher. And the gap. Unfortunately, many researchers find it very hard to write well because they do not know how to view their text from the perspective of the reader. And finally, the innovation. In this talk, we present a simple set of principles for good writing based on an understanding of how readers process information. Unlike such platitudes as be clear or omit needless words, our principles are constructive. One can easily check whether a piece of text satisfies them, and if it does not, the principles suggest concrete ways to improve it. Okay, so that's how I typically structure my abstracts. For intros, I do something very similar. It's just expanded. Now, of course, there's a lot of art in how you fill out a longer version of that CGI, but that's the basic idea. I want to mention that there's an alternative approach that Simon Peyton-Jones has suggested in his talk on writing papers, which is not totally different, except that he basically eliminates the context. So his suggestion is sort of get the reader immediately into it by starting with a concrete example. For example, like consider this Haskell program, that has some problem, and then this makes it immediately clear with that concrete example what the paper is about. I think if this works, it can be very effective, and for certain audiences, it's better than the CGI approach that I suggested. But you have to really, the first thing is you have to really know your audience and what their knowledge level is, right? For example, that they can read a Haskell code right off the bat, or that they're interested in Haskell code. That's true for something like ICFP. It may or may not be true for some other conference. So you have to sort of talk to your advisor and get some sense of the community that you're targeting. The other thing is I find that with a lot of the work I do, this doesn't quite work. It's just there's too much background to even understand the syntax of the key motivating example, and so you can't just jump into it immediately. You need a little background about the context of the work. That's my experience, but I think if you can make this work, it's great. So that's why I mentioned it. Okay, so moving on, the key ideas section. So this is a really key section that a lot of people, at least traditionally, I'm seeing it more and more in conference papers, but at least traditionally, this is a section that would often be missing in people's papers. And I think it's really important. So the idea of the key ideas section is that you want to sort of, it's like a bridge between the introduction, this very high level explanation of what your work is about, and the technical meat, okay? And the idea is to sort of view it as if you were trying to explain to your audience what your work is about at the whiteboard. All right. So imagine you're trying to explain your work by just drawing examples on the whiteboard. Okay, and that gives you the right intuition. In particular, you have to use concrete examples because you can't present some whole some big type system or whatever some full formal details or tables or whatever on the whiteboard. Instead, you're going to show the idea with some drawings and some some concrete examples. And that's just to get across the high level intuition, right? You're not trying to get across all the technical details. That's the point of the technical meat section later on. You don't have to show the general solution. That's the point of the technical meat section later on. You just have to give some examples that give sort of the key intuition. And that for many readers is going to be all they take away from your paper. They're not going to read the technical meat section, as I said later on. There's only 5 readers who are going to read that. So imagine, like, you want to write something that has some technical, content, some intuition, some key, meat in it, but it's something that most people can take away, even if they don't care about the details of your work. Now, many might say, why have such a section at all? And I would say the main reason, there's a couple of reasons. One is it forces you to have a takeaway. And I think that's important because, as I mentioned earlier, the reader wants to know what is interesting about your work. And what's interesting is this takeaway, this sort of insight, this intuition, separate from all the technical details, right? So it forces you to have that higher level takeaway. The second point is that many readers will only care about that takeaway, right? So they will just not care about the technical details. So you want to write something for them. And lastly, even for the experts who really do care about the technical details, having this key idea section is so useful as a means of scaffolding, right? Sort of helping the reader build up an understanding of what you're doing so that they will be able to understand the technical section later on. Okay. And lastly, I'm almost out of time, so I want to just briefly talk about related work. So the related work section is an incredibly important section because it's one of these sections that, especially for reviewing, right? Reviewers are trying to understand, they really want to understand what is the delta from prior work, what does your approach do that other approaches don't do, and so they will definitely really read that section carefully. In many cases, they will actually read it earlier on before they'll skim it earlier on to get a sort of intuition about what's going on before they get into the details of the work. However, I still recommend that you do not put this right after the introduction. So a lot of authors I see putting the related work section as section 2 of the paper, right? Or even built into the introduction. And I think this is the wrong way to go about it, because the point of the related work section is to give a detailed comparison of what you're doing with what prior work has done. And you can't really do that until you've explained what you're doing, okay? But you're not explaining what you're doing until you get to the key ideas and the technical meat. So it's always very awkward to try to explain in detail the comparison with the related work up front. I should emphasize, this does not mean that you don't talk about related work at all until the end of the paper. Of course you do. When you're explaining the gap of your work in the introduction of the paper, you have to say something about related work, typically, to say why prior work has not solved the problem you're trying to solve. But it's typically there a more high-level description of the related work, or a summary of what related work doesn't do that you are doing. And it's just that you just give enough there of a statement to make the gap clear. The related work is where you really give all the details, okay? And that's why it belongs, again, according to this top-down principle, it really belongs at the end of the paper. The other key thing is that in the related work section, you do not want to give a laundry list. A lot of people do this, and it's a clear signal that the related work section was written hastily, right before the deadline. Which, I mean, to be fair, the related work section is often written hastily right before the deadline, but you don't want to give that impression to the reader. And so when you just write a laundry list, meaning you just write, so-and-so did this, and then so-and-so did that, and you don't really say how it relates to what you did, then it really is very annoying to the reader. And often people do this because they think, oh, there's someone on the PC, I have to cite their paper. And they just cite it, without saying anything about it, and that's really irritating. So please don't do that. Please actually give real comparisons and explain in detail how your work fills the gap in a way that related work doesn't. A last point, which is not on the slide, is occurs to me is you do want to be kind, right? You don't want to be too mean in your comparisons with related work. You just want to be factually correct about what things you do that they don't do, and so it's important not to overstate the advances that you've made, but just give a sort of a detailed factual comparison. Okay. So to summarize, flow via old to new, coherence via one paragraph, 1 point, name your baby just in time, and short subjects are very common principles that come up. And then for higher level structure of paper, I recommend the CGI model for the abstract intro, scaffolding your presentation with a key ideas section, and lastly, putting a detailed comparison with related work at the end of the paper. And so with that, I conclude, and I'm very happy to take, I hope that this is useful to you as you start to write papers or continue to write papers, and I'm very happy to take your questions. Thank you.
Terrific.
Oh.
Well, we have a few questions in the Q&A tab right now.
Ah, great. I see several questions there. Should I think maybe the easiest thing is for me to just answer these questions directly.
Yeah, sounds good.
Okay. I think, these are sorted by latest. So I'm going to start with the earliest. Would you ever want to include the background information twice, once in the background section, reiterated when it's needed? That's a good question. Well, as I said, I typically don't have a background section per se, or I try to avoid having a background, a section that's just about background, because that typically by calling it a background section, it means it's going to be too big, and it's going to be, again, a violation of this just-in-time principle. So I typically just include the background at the point where I'm going to introduce something. I sort of have a little subsection there about how this has been done previously. Of course, sometimes sometimes that's not good enough, and sometimes you do need to repeat yourself because maybe you want to give some high-level background first and then lower-level background later on, and that's fine. That's the idea of sort of explaining this top-down thing, right? Explaining things at multiple levels of abstraction, and that can work fine. Yeah, I don't have it's hard to give a more precise answer to that question, but yeah, so sometimes you do, but I generally recommend thinking about, like, can I avoid a background section? Can I somehow work it, integrate it more into the other sections? Inventing unique names for your ideas is lots of fun, but could it ever be considered pretentious? Yeah, so I'm not suggesting that you come up with cutesy names. I'm just suggesting you come up with clear names for things that come up. You know, it could just be a little phrase that you use repeatedly, or you invent a term. You know, like I've had papers where there wasn't really a good term for something, or maybe there were several terms in the literature, and I picked one and I said it's known as this, okay, and then I keep using that term consistently. Other authors, you know, sometimes just use multiple terms because their multiple terms exist in the literature for something. That's confusing. But yeah, you want to try to avoid coming up with names that are too cutesy. Something that a related point here is actually that I left out something in my description of the structure of a paper, which often people ask about when I give this talk, which is how do you come up with good titles? Because in fact, if you were to add titles to my list, you'd see that the title is read by far more people than even the abstract. And so coming up with a good title is extremely important, and it's also something where I don't have very good advice. I tend to spend personally a long time thinking about the titles of my papers and trying to make them relatively short but informative and somewhat memorable, but not too cutesy. And this is like a very delicate balancing act. I don't know how to teach this yet. So yeah, but yeah, I do try to avoid being too cute or pretentious. Feeling about acronyms as baby names. I find I cannot read an acronym without expanding it, effectively making many papers much longer. Oh, I see. Yeah. So I was, again, to make it clear, when I said name your baby, I wasn't suggesting you give like an acronym to everything in the paper. I do often give an acronym to something if it's like really comes up throughout the entire paper and I'm repeating it all the time. But you're right that you can easily, if you come up with too many acronyms, it's very hard to keep track of what they mean. So I prefer to only do that when it's like a long phrase that I'm going to repeat over and over and over and over again. This probably depends on the specifics, but I versus we. Oh, I see. So this generally doesn't come up for me because I'm always working on multi-authored papers. And most people are most of the time. I think it's fine to just stick to we. Even when I've written sole authored papers, I think I used we, or I used, it doesn't really matter, to be honest. You can use I or we in that case. But it's very common for people to just use we, period. Should the abstract be a condensed version of the introduction? For me, yes. So typically that's how that's what I do. Actually, I typically leave the writing of the abstract until the very end when we're like, the day before submitting, because I find often the story of the paper changes frequently, and like, rather than keep the introduction and abstract in sync, it's easier to just write the introduction, keep working on the introduction until I'm satisfied with it, and then go and shorten that into a paragraph or 2-paragraph abstract at the end. So yeah, that's what I do. But other people like to write the abstract up front because they think it sort of helps them give a view for the whole paper. Either ways, it's sort of up to you. Do you have any advice on writing critiques or reviews of papers? It seems like a lot of information to fit into a small space. Oh yeah, well, I'm happy. So I think I'll take that question offline. So there's a lot to say about writing reviews, but it's a very different kind of skill from writing papers, and it's a very specific skill, right? So yeah, there's a lot to say about it, but I could discuss that if you want to chat about that. I'm happy to chat about that later, or after this talk, or later at the mentoring session. How to shorten the draft when it exceeds the page limit? Sometimes exceeds a lot. Yeah. That's a serious problem. So it's very often the case in my experience that we have too much to say in the paper. So the good thing about something like ICFP is that ICFP has one of the in my opinion, others may disagree about this, but is that ICFP has one of the largest page limits of any conference in programming languages. In fact, currently POPL and ICFP have the largest page limits, and I really appreciate that because I often find, especially with technical work, it's very hard to fit everything in, especially if you follow the principles that I've given you and you try to explain things top down and you try to give a key ideas section, you try to make things accessible to the reader, then that leaves less room for the technical meat later on. And my feeling is that those sections, right, those sections that more people will read are much more important to have in your paper than all the very, the gory details of the technical meat. You can often move a lot of those details into an appendix You know, in certain lines of work, you know, it's much less important. In certain kind of topics, it's less important. For example, most of the work that I do now is mechanized in a theorem prover, like the Coq proof assistant, and so like I don't feel I need to convince the reader as much that the work holds together. Like the theorem prover has checked that for me, but I do I'd much rather spend the time, spend the real estate of the paper explaining the ideas well and giving examples. So I think those are more important, but this is always a difficult problem. Is it ever a good idea to use new notation without explaining it, even if you think that notation is reasonably intuitive? You generally want to explain new notation whenever you introduce it. There's not many examples where you don't want to do that unless it's totally standard notation. And then lastly, I think this will be the last question because we're over time. How do appendices relate to the main parts of the paper? Well, they're typically not formally reviewed, so the reviewers are not obliged to actually read them. And I would view them as kind of like an extension of the technical meat. They're even more gory details than the technical meat provides. So like, I don't tend to work too hard on getting the appendices in great shape, to be honest. That's not like, I feel like that's more like backup information for those who are really interested. But ultimately, of course, when after you get the paper accepted, a lot of people in our field, myself included, like to prepare journal versions, extended journal versions of the paper, and there you then you do add in a lot of that technical meat from the appendix, and there you do want to actually explain it properly. But for conference submissions, the appendices are kind of just nice to have to back up the work. So on that. With that note, I think I will stop here. And if anyone has further questions, I'm happy to stick around during this next break. But it's been a pleasure talking to you, and I hope what I talked about is helpful.